make no friends in the pits and you take no prisoners. 1 minute you're up $500,000 in soybeans, and the next, boom, your kids don't go to college and they've repossessed your Bentley. Are you with me?
The revolution starts now.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Turn those machines back on!
You are about to enter the Peter Schiff Show.
Show me the money!
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth.
The Peter Schiff Show is on. Call in now. 855-4-SCHIFF. That's 855-472-4433.
I don't know when they decided that they wanted to make a virtue out of selfishness.
Your money, your stories, your freedom. The Peter Schiff Show.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Peter Schiff Show. I'm Tom Woods, in for Peter. Hope you'll join us for the next 2 hours. We've got as always, we've got a couple of great guests. Today it's Lew Rockwell, the great Lew Rockwell, whose website, lewrockwell.com, is the most heavily trafficked libertarian website in the world, who founded the Ludwig von Mises Institute, which, more than any other thing in this world, helped to shape my own thinking. And then we're going to be joined for so we're going to be talking about the present and the future with Lew. I'm going to talk about the past with Kevin Gutzman. Kevin Gutzman is the author of a book released just today called James Madison and the Making of America. And if you look at the blurbs on this thing from the most important Madison scholars out there, they're all saying this is the definitive biography of this man. Who was he? What did he believe? Why does it matter? Very, very important. Everybody claims to know all about the Founding Fathers. Well, nobody knows more about this subject and its relevance for today than Kevin Gutzman. Kevin's got a Ph.D. in history from University of Virginia, and he's also got a law degree. So the lawyers are too afraid to debate him because he knows too much history, and the historians are too afraid to debate him because he's got too much of a legal background. So he manages to get a lot done in his office. Nobody bothers him. Well, we're going to have an opportunity to talk to him about his Pulitzer Prize-nominated book, James Madison and the Making of America. That's in the second hour. But I want to start off right now just talking about, I don't know, what's going on in the world here. Because there is one silver lining, my friends, one silver lining to the economic picture and the fiscal disaster and the unemployment numbers. And the one silver lining is that it means that the Keynesians are going to start running out of explanations for what's going on. Now, listeners of this program will know who Keynesians are. These are followers of the economist John Maynard Keynes. And by and large, if the Keynesians teach anything, it's that the free market cannot be trusted on its own, basically, to maintain full employment. It tends chronically toward unemployment or underemployment of resources. And that we need the government as some kind of helmsman over the economy to keep it on an even keel. And so, for example, when we see the economy overheating, well, then the government is supposed to pull spending out of the economy. And when we see that there's too much unemployment, it's supposed to pump spending into the economy, and it can do this through fiscal policy or monetary policy. But the main problem that the Keynesians ran into is in the early 1970s, they had both problems simultaneously. They had price inflation, prices going up very high, but also unemployment going up very high. Now, prices going up very high means you're supposed to pull spending out, but unemployment being very high means you're supposed to pump spending in. So what were the Keynesians supposed to do in that situation? Well, the answer is nobody knew, which is why the Keynesians began to fall from grace at that point. But then, after the panic of 2008, well, suddenly it's all the rage again. This just goes to show the total bankruptcy of mainstream economics. They just did not know what to do in the face of this crisis, other than basically to call for, massive fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus. That's it. That's the entire toolkit. That's all they have. And so as we go year after year after year with no progress, eventually people are going to realize, especially the young kids coming up in these economics programs, that the old fuddy-duddies teaching them these remedies have no idea what they're talking about. Now, Peter played for you last week a clip from Jack Lew, the White House's Jack Lew, saying, my gosh, the unemployment picture is so much better than we had any right to expect. It is just doing great. And superficially, you might think, well, at least he's got a tiny case because it's down to down to the horrendous level of 8.3%. But the reason for this is that the labor force participation rate is at the lowest level it's been since May of 1983. That might have a teensy-weensy bit to do with it. The federal government doesn't count people who have become so discouraged looking for work that they've just dropped out of the labor force entirely. They're just given up out of sheer despair. So they don't count these people anymore. So the more despair there is, the better the numbers look. So don't worry about the unemployment figures undercutting my point. To the contrary. So what I found interesting was I came across this interview with a guy named Stephen Roach. Now here's a guy, establishment. He's an establishment with a capital E. Stephen Roach. He's the head of Morgan Stanley Asia. He's a Yale professor. And it's very, very rare to hear a true believer in any intellectual paradigm admitting, I don't know what to think. My traditional way of thinking seems to be failing, and I don't know where to go from here. Very rare to hear somebody do that. But in this interview, which was fairly recent, Roach said, I think what we found in 08 and 09 is that aggressive monetary and fiscal stimulus can stop the crisis, but it can't spark a sustainable recovery. Wow. Well, that is a huge admission we would not have gotten from Keynesians in earlier years. In the 1960s, they were confident that the business cycle had been abolished forever. That was what Arthur Okun wrote in his 1970 book, The Political Economy of Prosperity. And then 2 months after his book came out, the recession officially hit. So poetic justice, everybody. It's not dead. And then he goes on to say, this again, Stephen Roach of Yale and Morgan Stanley Asia, he says, it's really hard to agree on the type of policy agenda that could have a lasting impact. Ah, very good. But then I think most significant of all, this is a point I've made, is that it's very easy for the federal government after the fact, when there's been some business cycle, it's very easy for them to say, well, after the fact, with 20/20 vision and in hindsight, here are the regulations that would have stopped this particular series of events from occurring. Well, duh, anybody can do that. But the point is, you're not going to get that exact type of outcome again. So in other words, like the TSA, we are protected forever against the next shoe bomber. So that's why there isn't going to be another shoe bomber. That's the problem. So here we've got exactly the same issue, that, okay, they're going to try and prevent a subprime crisis from happening again. But as Stephen Roach says, he says, we'll probably make sure a subprime crisis never happens again, but it probably would never happen again anyway. And then he goes on to say, so have we really figured out how to avoid crises? He says, I think the odds suggest there will be another crisis, especially with excess liquidity and reckless fiscal policies in place. I just don't know where and when. Well, there you go, my friends. There it is. They're dead from the neck up, the Keynesians, but now they're wonderful human beings, perhaps. Treat them with dignity and respect, but in terms of their ideas, it's time to stick the knife in and twist it around. So when the Korean edition of my book, Meltdown, about the Panic of 08 came out, the Korean edition subtitle was, Keynes must die so the economy may live. Wise words, those, my friends. All right, join the conversation, 855-4SHIFT. That's 855-472-4433. The Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio. Stick around.
I hate to beg like a dog without his bone, but I'm busted.
The Peter Schiff Show.
My brother said there ain't a thing I can do. My wife and my kids are all down with the flu. And I was just thinking about calling on you, and I'm busted.
Since the Peter Schiff Show was last on the air, the national debt added another $7.89 million. Luckily, Peter's intelligence is growing twice as fast.
That's incredible.
Welcome back to your source of sanity in an insane world. It's the Peter Schiff Show.
And we are back on the Peter Schiff Show. Tom Woods in for Peter. As always, talking about the economy. I suppose not always, but it's such a tempting target, unfortunately. So before I go to the phones, and again, I urge you, give me a ring at 855-4SHIFT. That's 855-472-4433. If you want to know where you should put your money, that's a question for Peter. And I'm not getting in the middle of that one. That's a separate question. But before going to the phones, just a couple more things that I want to bring to your attention. just so that we have a sense of what's coming here in 2012. I read, now this has been, I guess this has been known since late 2011, but there have been some recent reports on it. Something called the Economic Cycles Research Institute is forecasting a pretty rough recession for 2012. And you may think, well, big deal, another organization I've never heard of calling for a recession or predicting one. But the significant thing here is that they are a very mainstream organization. They do not make reckless calls. They're not known for, predicting 15 of the last 3 recessions. They're very cautious in their predictions. For them to say this is very significant. The World Bank is also saying that we can expect a global economic slowdown. And there's one official at the bank, Hans Timmer, who said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said something along the lines of, I think we need to go beyond just sort of preparing for a garden variety recession and preparing instead for drastic changes coming our way. Now, as you know, it's not the World Bank's job to say things like that. It's their job to massage the data and make everybody feel better. So this is all very disturbing stuff, folks, and it doesn't bring me any pleasure to report it. The one piece of good news, here's when you know you're in trouble. The one piece of good news comes from the Congressional Budget Office, because that's fake. So the good news is fake, and the bad news is real. So the CBO is telling us that the deficit is going to start coming down. So, all you people worried about the deficit, come on now. The CBO says that between 2013 and 2021, we're going to see major progress on the deficit. In fact, by 2015, the deficit, which has been over $1 trillion for several years running now, the deficit will be down to $205 billion. Now, how could they predict something like this, right? You have to ask, where is that coming from? Well, there's 2 possibilities. One is they really think the economy is going to be super robust, and that'll mean everybody's earning, more people employed with higher incomes. Higher incomes mean more tax revenues. More tax revenues, in theory anyway, would mean lower deficits. Or, to the contrary, we could also have massive spending cuts, a massive fiscal discipline kicking in, and that the federal government won't just kick this can down the road. Well, if you think either one of those is plausible, then I urge you to check out CBO and deficits. If not, just shake your head, pound your head into the wall. I don't know what else to tell you. All right, let's head over to the phones. I want to talk to Kenneth in Oxford, Mississippi. Is that where you are, Kenneth? Oxford, Mississippi?
Yes.
I just want to make sure they know that the 2-letter postal code, that it is indeed MS. All right, welcome to the program.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
I was doing my own little economic working a few months back, and I put on a forum. I can't remember which forum. I put a little preview of it to get a little bit of feedback.
Okay.
It was basically panned because this was the example that I chose to use when I was talking about inflation.
All right.
All right. Say you have a basket of apples. All right. You buy this basket of apples for $5. And you keep the basket of apples for a while, then the basket of apples goes up to $10, and you buy a basket of apples for $10 at a later date. Why did the price go up? Did you really make a profit? I said that if it went up due to inflation, then in the short run, fairly break even, if that. And in the long run, your losses are practically incalculable your long-term losses as a result of that one transaction. All right, now there were some people that took big issue with this. One of the biggest criticisms that I got was that inflation has no effect whatsoever on prices.
Okay, well, you're kind of breaking up a little bit, so give me quickly what their argument is.
They're basically saying that what I'm saying can't be valid because inflation has no effect on prices.
And they didn't justify the statement?
They tried to justify it through some what looks like econometrics to me. I'm not good at econometrics, but I do know that when you have more of a supply of something with demand remaining the same, the item itself is worth less.
Yeah, okay. Well, all right. Well, thanks for the call, Kenneth. We'll see how we can deal with this. Now, I've come across this once in a while, too, and part of the way they'll make the argument is they'll use the current situation, and they'll say, look at how much the monetary base has been increased, and we haven't seen that much inflation, although now we are starting to see a little bit of price inflation, so they won't even be able to use that argument anymore. But the answer to that is that the money's not, at least up till recently, was not getting out into the economy. It was just sitting, it was parked at the Federal Reserve with skittish banks keeping it there. They want to prop up their balance sheets, and frankly, they didn't buy the green shoots propaganda, and so they want to play it safe. And so it's not getting into the economy, so the money multiplier, the process by which the fractional reserve system increases the money supply is not operative. That's the reason that we don't see it. As soon as that happens, then you will see. I mean, this particular argument it sort of flies in the face of Federal Reserve monetary policy. I mean, the whole idea that they've, well, at least in some cases they've pursued is that if the price level is going up too much, then they'll have to tighten monetary policy. Now, why would they do that if they thought there was no connection between monetary policy and prices? So, yeah, I think your analysis is perfectly fine, that if you have some good and its price on the market increases nominally, but the increase is due just to inflation, so from a purchasing power standpoint, it's the same. This is bad for you in the long run. I mean, on the one hand, you could think that maybe it's a wash, right? What difference does it make, really? If the price level is twice what it used to be, as long as everybody has twice the income, what difference does it make? But the problem is that it interferes with economic calculation, because it's hard for you to know, is the value of my apples going up, the price of my apples going up, is that due to an increased demand for apples, or is that due to an overall increase in prices in the economy because there's been an increase in the money supply? Well, you can't, nobody's omniscient. No, you can't really know that. And a lot of times this leads to capital consumption. People don't realize they're consuming their capital because they're just looking at the paper profits that they're earning. But these profits are only on paper. So it does do you damage. But this idea that it has no effect on prices, that all that extra money and credit that was poured into the economy after 2001, after 9/11, and that thanks to government regulations was directed primarily into the mortgage market, that there's no connection between that and the higher housing prices? Or how about this? Suppose the money supply, let's reduce the money supply to $100. There's only $100 in the entire economy. You're going to tell me that prices aren't going to be affected by that? You're still going to be able to charge $1,000 for a flat screen TV when there's only $100 in the whole economy? Now, okay, so I've taken it to an absurd degree, but the point is that the logic of it is pretty clear. Now, I think this is just a way for lackeys of the regime to try to explain away the in effect, to try to cover over the sins of the regime. That's the way I look at it. All right, let's go to, we've only got about a minute, so let's go to Steve in Nashville. Steve, welcome to the program.
Hey, man, it's an honor to talk to you. I wanted to ask you about what your take is on all of the cash that the companies are holding. Austrian authors seem to kind of be ignoring that phenomenon. Do you think all this cash could possibly come back into the economy and provide a pretty good boom?
So you're talking about the fact that businesses are holding back from expanding and they're just sitting on cash?
Yes. I'm thinking maybe, I don't know, but maybe like the election results of 2012, maybe a catalyst that would encourage them to come back. And when they do, if they bring all that cash back into the economy, that could be enough to fund a pretty serious boom. What do you think of that?
Well, it's not impossible. I mean, we definitely want more investment. That's definitely a plus for the economy. And one of the things that holds investment back is uncertainty. If there's one thing the private sector wants, it's stability. And they certainly haven't gotten it under Obama. I'm not so sure they're going to get it under his successor either, but they may think so. And yes, that would help. All right, ladies and gentlemen, coming up on the other side of this break, the great Lou Rockwell of LouRockwell.com. Never a dull moment with Lou. This is not Jack Lou. This is the good Lou. Stick around. The Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio.
The Peter Schiff Show. We now return to the Peter Schiff Show.
Call in now, 855-4-SCHIFF.
That's 855-472-4433.
Rebel Radio, the Peter Schiff Show.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. I'm Tom Woods in for Peter Schiff today. Very happy to be joined right now by the great Lou Rockwell of LouRockwell.com, which if you are not reading every day, you are missing out on some of the best thought, interesting nuggets of information, and it's your own darn fault, because Ron Paul's been telling you for years that's his first stop on the internet every morning. Should be yours as well, LouRockwell.com. Lou Rockwell, I don't know how many things the guy's done in his life. It's just a ton. I would just mention a few. He was chief of staff for Congressman Paul years ago. He is the founder of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. It's a very difficult thing to do, found your own institute and have the thing actually work and take off. And this year it celebrates 30 years of the Mises Institute, and there is no institution on this earth that did more to shape my own thinking than the Mises Institute. And I attended its summer program for the first time in 1993, and I never looked back after that. I was a committed Austrian from that point on, and if it hadn't been for that, I would have just been some generic, nothing. But thanks to the Mises Institute, here I am. Lou's site is graced by two blogs. You've got to read the Lou Rockwell blog, but also Lou Rockwell's Political Theater to keep up with what's going on in the world of politics with Lou's inimitable style. Ladies and gentlemen, Lou Rockwell. Lou, thanks for being with me on the program today.
Oh, Tom, thanks so much for having me on.
Well, my pleasure. Let's start off by just filling people in on something that maybe people heard bits and pieces of, but not everybody got the whole picture. What do you know about the situation with Ron Paul in Maine? What do you think's going on there?
Well, it sure looks suspicious. What happened was that there was a prediction of a small snowstorm, 2 to 4 inches, and in Washington County, which is I think the poorest county in Maine, also the strongest Ron Paul county, because of course the rich tend to be for Romney, working people and poor people in the Republican Party tend to be for Ron Paul. But they closed the caucus. They said we're not going to have a caucus. But this is Maine, by the way, Maine, where everybody is used. I have some familiarity with Maine and with the rest of New England, as I know you do too. Everybody knows how to cope with snow in Maine. The idea that anything would be closed with that kind of a snow prediction is just nonsense. But they did close this caucus where Ron Paul was predicted to do very well. My guess is he would have done better than the 196 votes that ended up separating him from Romney. And also they said, by the way, we'll hold the caucus later, but the votes aren't going to count. No matter how people vote in that county, it's not going to change the result of the overall straw poll, and this is a straw poll in Maine. Well, there's been so much outrage, so much pressure, that now the Maine GOP is saying, well, maybe we will count these votes. So that it's going to be they're going to have the caucus. There are about 6,000 registered Republicans in that county, and we'll have to see what the turnout is. But it's possible that Ron will win the Maine, the Maine caucus. Just as, however, in the case of Iowa, when the awful Santorum actually won it, or so they claim, because I think there was a lot of shenanigans in Iowa as well, and that Ron may very well have won that caucus. But anyway, in the official result, Romney won it. Then the officials changed it. Oh no, it was Santorum, but that had no effect. And had Ron been announced as the winner of the Maine caucus, it would have had a tremendous effect for momentum, for morale, for everybody taking more notice of him. So they, my own guess is that they deliberately shut him down by closing up that county and maybe by doing some other things too.
I thought it was interesting to see the chairman of the Republicans in Washington County saying something like, well, I don't think it's going to change the outcome, but our people's voices should be heard. And I mean, it was like he doesn't want anything to change, but he feels like he's got to at least make the appearance that he cares about the people in the county.
I'm sure he feels he'll be dead if it changes.
That's right.
So he's not at all happy at the idea of a fair vote. But my own view is that many American elections have been corrupt. This wasn't just Mayor Daley in Chicago. It's a trope of democracy, as a matter of fact. And when we consider, especially in a situation like today, when trillions of dollars and vast amounts of power and glory are available to those who win elections, we can't really be surprised that politicians, of all people, who politics tends to attract the crooked as well as the power hungry. It seems to me we can't be surprised that they would actually finagle around the margins. Now, I don't think it's possible for them to entirely steal an election, that is, if there's a broad consensus for one candidate. But on the margin, they can do it. So, as we know in Maine, this is a very tight race. And it was interesting, a couple of days before the election, the chairman of the Maine GOP said, well, it's going to be very tight. It's going to be 200 votes separating Ron Paul and Mitt Romney. Well, either he's a great prognosticator or maybe he knew something. I don't know, because it was almost 200 votes that separated the two of them. And was that polling? I mean, how did he know that? It's an interesting point. He maybe is just a blabbermouth.
Maybe so. I want to switch gears for a minute because I want to get your thoughts on last night we had Judge Napolitano's last Freedom Watch broadcast, and I tuned in just on that 3% chance that he was going to announce to us that there was an even bigger show coming, and that we shouldn't be sad about the loss of Freedom Watch. I am sad. There was never a show quite like that one. But doesn't it seem to you that there is obviously a demographic for this show? What I thought the brilliance of Roger Ailes in bringing that show on, even though he might not agree with it, was that he recognized that no network was appealing to this demographic, and we are out there. So do you think that there'll be another media entrepreneur who will perceive this and act on it, or do you think that the Internet is proceeding in such leaps and bounds that by the time the network news catches on to our existence, we'll already have like an Internet network?
Well, there is movement, in fact, right now to try to set up some kind of Internet network, and also to set by some wealthy people to try to buy their own cable network or start their own cable network to have libertarian programs. So I certainly hope something like that can happen. Certainly, as you on the Schiff show show that this is there's room on the Internet, obviously, for these kinds of ideas, especially the Internet is our home. But I feel optimistic about the judge's future, even though I'm very sad about the cancellation of the show. I think there's never been anything like it, certainly in my lifetime, in which, unfortunately, encompasses the history of television, that there's never been anything like this. Just a tremendous production. But he is such an amazing figure. I mean, he is, in addition to his scholarly accomplishments and his accomplishments as a judge and so forth, he's a TV star. I mean, he's the real deal. He really is a star. So I think there were very good things ahead for him. But of course, I think it's extremely unfortunate Fox did it. It is their property. But I think it's very much too bad.
Now, after several days of people absolutely flooding Fox with angry emails, the judge made a request of his fans not to do that anymore, that he wanted to take this decision with dignity and grace and move on, and that he had confidence that bigger and better things were coming, and, as usual, taking the high road and being a gentleman. But I suspect that outpouring of support is not anything they expected, and that's got to help his position there in the long run.
No, they didn't expect it, I'm sure, and this sort of thing is pretty unusual, as a matter of fact. It's happened in the history of television, but it's unusual. But he's got still 2 years on his contract at Fox, and they have to keep paying him, so they'll be using him in other shows, and who knows what's possible. I just think as he himself said, there are good things ahead for him. And he did that. In fact, he asked us twice on Facebook for people please to stop writing that their voices have been heard and now's the time to lay off. Yeah.
So given that I was one of the ones who told them to bombard Fox, I thought it was only right for me to also post that he's saying to stop doing that.
No, well, of course, I'm in the same position.
Well, I mean, it seemed like the thing to do. We're helping out a friend. But let's switch back, though. I wanted to get your thoughts on the judge, but I want to go back to Ron Paul. And I don't want you to feel like you're stepping on any toes. This is a totally hypothetical question that you're being asked on the radio. You didn't know you were going to be asked it, so nothing you say is your fault. But what would be your strategy for the campaign right now, given the state of things, the opinion polls, the delegates, it's just everything? what issues would you have him emphasizing? What changes would you make? What would you suppose we just put you in charge? What would you do?
Well, that would be a daunting prospect. I think I remember back to the Pew polls of a few months ago when they did some intensive polling, especially of young voters, and they discovered that the key issue among young voters who supported Ron Paul was war and peace, that they were very anti-war. And I think that already Ron has changed the whole political dynamic and the climate of opinion on the questions of war and peace by simply raising the issue. It's quite astounding. I mean, it's further proof of what I think a lot of us have thought, that the reason that there was such a hate campaign against anyone who would advocate peace, question the empire, question the perpetual wars, was because they were afraid. They were afraid that if it ever started being debated, it was possible for them to lose, and I think very, very possible. So I would love to see Ron to keep emphasizing his core issues, which are war and peace, the Federal Reserve, and the economy and civil liberties. And again, there's nobody in politics who talks about any of these issues. I mean, the Republicans blab on about how they're going to cut, but of course they don't. They never cut. They're maybe even bigger spenders than Obama. Certainly as big spenders as Obama. And just as when we had George W. Bush in, if we had George W. Bush Romney in, then it's going to be exactly the same sort of thing, maybe worse, and maybe he's even more of a warmonger than Obama. So I think for purposes of his campaign, as well as for purposes of the broader movement and the whole future of freedom, he absolutely needs to keep emphasizing and talking about the fact that the government is building a police state, unprecedented in American history, except maybe during Lincoln and Wilson. We had similar sorts of police states, but those came to an end. This, of course, they want to have, and they're building the institutions to have it in perpetuity. I just noticed today that the Pentagon is asking permission from the FAA, which of course is just they're going to have no trouble getting their permission to fly their combat drones in American airspace. That as they bring back their combat drones from Iraq or other places, they want to fly them over the U.S. So that's where we're headed, and only Ron Paul is talking about the fact that we have a near dictatorship, and maybe an elected dictatorship or a rotating dictatorship, but it still is a dictatorship where the president asserts to himself the power to kill anybody he wants anywhere in the world, foreigner or American, if he thinks they're a bad guy, to arrest them in secret, imprison them in secret indefinitely, torture them in secret. How's that any different from any other dictator? So we have that going on, and of course the massive growth of the surveillance state, also something that only Ron Paul is talking about, and the Patriot Act and all these similar things. So and he also, of course, is the only one who's talking about actual cuts. The rest of them talk about cuts in the rate of increase, but nobody in the Republican Party, except Ron Paul, talks about actually cutting spending, what Murray Rothbard used to call a cut. A cut is when they cut in the rate of increase, which of course is just a example of political phony baloney. So only Ron is talking about these things. But I would love to see him, again, for the future, maybe, it's probably unlikely he's going to run as an independent, but who knows? Who knows what's going to happen there? But just for the future of his movement, for the future of what he's done with the young people and what he continues and will continue to do with the young people, and what the cause of liberty, it's not only in this country, around the world, because he has followers among especially young people all over the world. I mean, maybe he could be elected president of the world, I don't know. But there's nobody else who comes close to that.
Right.
So that's what I would like to see happen.
Well, Lou, stick around for a minute, please, because on the other side of this break, I'm going to see if I can get you to say something controversial for a change. I want to talk about, we'll talk about Austrian economics, and then I want to talk about what do we say to the Ron Paul kids. Let's say things don't work out this time around. What do they do? What do we focus their energies on in the future? That's next with Lou Rockwell here on the Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio. Don't go away.
The Peter Schiff Show.
to President Obama, Secretary Geithner, Madam Pelosi, and all of the socialist econ professors across America.
We're sorry.
Peter Schiff is back on the air.
And we are back here on the Peter Schiff Show. Tom Woods in for Peter, joined by Lou Rockwell of LouRockwell.com, the indispensable source of information for all you guys, in addition to Peter. Lou, can you give us, you founded, and because we talked so long, we've got only about probably 5 minutes in this segment, so can you give me like the 2-minute layman's overview of what Austrian economics is? You founded the Ludwig von Mises Institute, Mises.org, MISES.org. And a lot of people are hearing this term for the first time, and they're really new to all this. So how could you explain to them in a nutshell basically what it is and why it should matter to us?
Tom, may I say something quick about delegates?
Please,
your previous question?
Yeah, sure.
I wanted to say that I think that Ron's strategy of concentrating on the caucus states, the non-winner-take-all states, the smaller states, makes a lot of sense because he is accumulating delegates. He may have already accumulated more delegates than any other candidate in these last 4 caucus states, despite what the straw poll, for reasons that it's the Ron Paul people who are running as delegates, who stay to the end of the meeting, who are checking all the boxes, filling out all the forms and so forth, in order to become delegates. So the reports that we're getting back is he's continuing to accumulate delegates. So by the time this is all over, and by the way, it is actually possible to win the nomination without ever having won a primary or a caucus. Admittedly, that's a pretty distant prospect, but it's not impossible. But still, this could very well be an open convention. Ron is going to have a significant number of delegates. Tampa is going to be an interesting prospect. I think, and we already hear people saying, well, they're going to nominate Jeb Bush. Maybe that is what they want to do, although it strikes me as disastrous on a number of different levels.
Yeah.
But so his whole caucus strategy is very interesting. As to Austrian economics, I guess in sort of if we can sort of, mostly people are interested in sort of the implications from a policy standpoint of Austrian economics. And I think, first of all, the Austrian school and all the great economists who comprise its main branch, when we're talking about, it was founded by Karl Menger, and who was a tutor to the Crown Prince of Austria, a very important journalist who became a very important economist, and really the founder of the Austrian school. Eugen von Bauwerk, who was an important cabinet officer many times in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire and a very important economist as well at the University of Vienna, especially Ludwig von Mises, the greatest of these men who wrote so many books. I'm going to come back to him in a moment. And then F.A. Hayek, his colleague and student Murray Rothbard, Henry Hazlitt, who was not an official economist but certainly a magnificent economist and journalist. And there are just a host of great young Austrian economists today all over the Western world, in Asia and Latin America and the United States. It's a burgeoning school. It really is the only international school besides Marxism, and it's growing. But from a policy standpoint, we can think of the Austrian school as coming to the conclusion that the less the government does, the better. In fact, we'd be better off if there were no government intervention whatsoever in the economy. That is the path to the greatest prosperity, the greatest extension of the division of labor, the greatest specialization, which builds civilization and also builds prosperity. I'll just talk about Mises. He can go over some of his books. His first book.
We've got about a minute and a half, and so good luck.
Well, Theory of Money and Credit, he showed that a central bank like the Fed, before the Fed was founded, would be an unbelievable disaster in bringing about the business cycle, inflation, redistribution, and social chaos. He was the first one in his great book, Socialism, to show that socialism, because there are no prices for the means of production, means total economic chaos and total poverty and the decivilization of society, which is what we saw in the Soviet Union and these other places. He wrote Human Action, which was a total reconstruction of all of economics from the standpoint of the individual actor, the individual acting human being, and how you can build all of economic theory just from that from that one person, and you can understand, again, what builds civilization, what builds prosperity, and why the government and government intervention, certainly government intervention in the economy, is the opposite of civilization and prosperity. Murray Rothbard showed that we don't really want a government at all in the terms of a coercive government. We need governance, in whether it's Boy Scouts or a family or whatever, but not in society at large through the state. The state is the enemy of mankind on earth.
I got to jump in here, Lou. Thank you so much for spending time with us. As always, interesting stuff from Lou Rockwell. Check out LouRockwell.com. You got to do that every day. And Mises.org, MISES.org. Learn this stuff. And stick around. We got some more myth-busting to do on the other side of this break. You're listening to The Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio.
Make no friends in the pits and you take no prisoners. 1 minute you're up $500,000 in soybeans and the next, boom, your kids don't go to college and they've repossessed your Bentley. Are you with me?
The revolution starts now.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Turn those machines back on!
You are about to enter the Peter Schiff Show.
Show me the money!
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth.
The Peter Schiff Show is on.
Call in now. 855-4-SCHIFF.
That's 855-472-4433.
I don't know when they decided that they wanted to make a virtue out of selfishness.
Your money, your stories,
your freedom.
The Peter Schiff Show.
And we are back on the Peter Schiff Show. Tom Woods in for Peter. Very pleased to be joined by our second guest, Kevin Gutzman. Kevin Gutzman holds a master's and a PhD in history from the University of Virginia, and he holds a bachelor's, a Master of Public Affairs degree, and a law degree from the University of Texas at Austin. Now, last time I hosted this program, I had a couple of guests on, and I was estimating their combined IQ, and I don't want to abuse this too much, but I would say, having known Kevin for a long time, I would estimate Kevin's IQ at somewhere in the ballpark of about 527. So I'm very glad to be joined by him. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, which is a great book. And in the interest of full disclosure, I'll point out that Kevin and I wrote a book together called Who Killed the Constitution? In fact, over the course of 10 years, people write to me when they don't know the answer to something. Well, when I don't know the answer to something, I write to Kevin. And over the course of 10 years, there was one time that he wrote back to me and said his answer was, I don't know. And I said, Kevin, I think in 10 years you are entitled to one I don't know. So today we're going to talk about his new book that is released just today. So this is, unless you were listening to the Mike Church show earlier today, this is the first interview you're going to be hearing on this subject. This brand new book, very important, endorsed by major Madison scholars and Founding Father scholars. Very serious book by St. Martin's. James Madison and the Making of America. Kevin Gutzman, welcome to the Peter Schiff Show.
Hello, Tom. I'm happy to be here.
Well, let's zip right in here, because this time's going to fly by so fast you won't believe it. Let's start right into this. Now, James Madison served in various capacities over the course of his career, but what he's known as among the general public is as the father of the Constitution. But in your book, you use rather a different term to refer to his relation to the Constitution. What is your thinking about this? Is this myth or reality?
I think it's a complete myth, and so I call him an unhappy stepfather. Basically, Madison went to the Philadelphia Convention with an idea of a national government giving a general legislative authority to the federal Congress and a veto over state laws to the federal Congress. He wanted to remove from the states their role in choosing members of Congress, and he was defeated on all these measures. In fact, the one he called his favorite proposal was the congressional veto over all state laws, and although he kept bringing that up over and over again, he kept being defeated on it. He also insisted through the convention that both houses of Congress ought to be apportioned by population, and this, despite the fact that he was repeatedly warned by small state delegates that if he didn't cease insisting on this, it was possible he would just break up the convention without anything being accomplished. And finally, he was voted down on that, too. As we know, the Senate enshrines the principle of state equality. So Madison left the convention complaining about the Constitution and sure that it would lead to a breakup of the Union within a few years.
Now, you are probably, I don't want to boast about you too much. I think it's too late for that, but you may be the most knowledgeable person about the Virginia Ratifying Convention of anybody around today. Now, the we're talking about the conventions by which the states decided whether or not they wanted to ratify the Constitution. Now, what you dig up in this book regarding what went on at that ratifying convention is of great significance, but it sounds, when I describe it right now, it sounds kind of technical and like a historical curiosity. What went on at the Virginia Ratifying Convention that would be of interest to us today?
Well, listeners need to know that the Constitution was implemented by the separate states, each agreeing for itself to live under it, or another way of putting that is that they each agreed to ratify it. And what happened in the Virginia ratification process was contrary to what we've always been told about the way the Constitution was understood when it was adopted. And now, why is this important? The reason is that, as Madison later said, it is to the ratification conventions that we're to look for the actual meaning of the Constitution, because it wasn't among the delegates meeting in secret in Philadelphia that the people's understanding was hashed out. That was hashed out in public discussion in each of the states. So what happened in Virginia was that the people were told, if you agree to this Constitution, it will give the federal government only a few carefully enumerated powers. The understanding of it that we're giving you right here is going to be binding, as if we were one of 13 parties to a contract. And in case the federal government should pervert the powers we're granting it to your oppression, meaning Virginia's oppression, you could reclaim the powers you're granting it. Another way of putting that is, of course, a later term, in case you find that this government doesn't suit your purposes, you can secede. This was the Federalist position in Virginia. Now, we've always been told that this was a radical, states' rights-centered, anti-Federalist position taken by people who didn't like the Constitution in the first place. And what I show in this book is that, no, it was Madison's chief two fellow proponents of ratification, the governor of Virginia, Edmund Randolph, and the delegate from Jefferson's home county, Albemarle, George Nicholas, who laid out this position for a 5-man committee of which Madison was a member, and nobody contradicted this. In other words, Virginia went into the Union with the understanding that the central government would have only a few powers that were listed, and in case they decided it didn't suit their purposes, Virginia could withdraw from the Union.
Well, that is a little bit. This is not the sort of history that one reads either in the mainstream take or in the neoconservative take on things, and it actually makes me wonder, why do you think it is that if you talk to people from, let's say, the Federalist Society, which for people who don't know is that's a society of conservative lawyers at law schools, and they promote lectures and debates on law school campuses, how come it seems like the Federalist Society and Washington, D.C. think tanks, why do they overwhelmingly seem to prefer Madison to Thomas Jefferson?
Well, because they associate him with the Federalist. That is, those 85 newspaper essays that that Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote in trying to sell the Constitution. And they've equated the Federalist with the Supreme Court decisions of John Marshall. So what we have here is a kind of, I think of it as guilt by association, that because Madison was involved in the Federalist and Marshall cited some of the Federalist essays in Supreme Court decisions, therefore Madison must have agreed with Marshall. But actually one thing I show in the book is that Madison disapproved of some of the seminal Supreme Court decisions handed down by John Marshall, most notably arguably the most important decision in Supreme Court history, Mcculloch versus Maryland, which was based by Marshall on the idea that not 13 separate states, but one American people had agreed to the Constitution. And what the implication of this was that no state could resist whatever the federal government decided to do. Well, the interesting thing about that, as I show in this book, is that Marshall was another one of the members of that 5-man committee that I just mentioned, of which Madison was a member, and of which 2 members explained this the significance of ratification by saying, again, we're going to be one of 13 parties to a compact. The federal government's going to have a few powers, and in case it abuses the powers we're giving it, we can reclaim them, which is another way of saying we can secede from the Union. Now, Marshall in Mcculloch versus Maryland said exactly the opposite of all that. And Marshall knew what he was doing. I once asked a friend of mine, Kent Neumeyer, who's a very prominent legal history professor at the University of Connecticut and a biographer of John Marshall, Kent, did John Marshall ever once cite the ratification conventions in any of his Supreme Court decisions? And Neumeyer's answer was no. So, on one hand, Madison says that the place you're to find the meaning of the Constitution is in the ratification conventions, and on the other hand, Marshall never cited the ratification conventions. Why didn't he? Well, one reason might be that in the Virginia Ratification Convention, again, the version of the Constitution that the Federalists, Marshall and his people, gave the Virginians was the opposite of the one that Chief Justice Marshall gave us in his Supreme Court decisions.
All right, there's a lot to talk about here. We're going to take a break. We're joined by Kevin Gutzman, author of the brand new book, James Madison and the Making of America. Visit him online at kevingutzman.com. That's Gutzman, kevingutzman.com. Stick around here on the Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio.
The Peter Schiff Show.
To President Obama, Secretary Geithner, Madam Pelosi, and all of the socialist econ professors across America.
We're sorry.
We're sorry.
Peter Schiff is back on the air.
We are indeed back on the Peter Schiff Show, but it's Tom Woods in for Peter, joined by Professor Kevin Gutzman, Professor of History at Western Connecticut State University, author of the brand new book, James Madison and the Making of America, published by St. Martin's, which, by the way, is a hugely significant publisher. Visit him on the web, kevingutzman.com. So, Kevin, basically to sum up what we've said so far is that you look to the ratifying conventions to understand the intentions behind the Constitution, because this is where the people themselves hash the whole thing out. And so this is, rather than relying on a closed-door session in Philadelphia, we rely on these open debates at these ratifying conventions. But you've got somebody like John Marshall, who was there in Virginia, who was there in Richmond at the ratifying convention. He knows what was said. He knows that people were told the federal government would have only the powers expressly delegated to it. Then he gets on the court and says, well, I don't see the word expressly. Well, but the point is that's how it was sold to people. So at some level, do you think that there is some... there's just something fishy about this. I mean, already by the early 1790s, Madison is already concerned that this Constitution is being... that the very complaints that the opponents of the Constitution had are being vindicated right before his eyes. He's already concerned that it's being interpreted too broadly. Walk us through this.
Well, that's exactly right. And my mentor in law school, Lino Graglia at the University of Texas Law School, says constitutional government presumes that people in office will behave in good faith. That is, if somebody is just an out-and-out liar like John Marshall, then the project falls down. I mean, requiring the guy to take an oath to uphold the Constitution was supposed to ensure that people wouldn't behave this way, and if you wanted the federal government to have power that the people had not willingly consented for it to have, you would seek an amendment, not just say the opposite of what you had said in the ratification convention. And so essentially that's what people like Marshall were in the project of doing. Madison, of course, had sold the Constitution in this way, as had people in several other states, and it wasn't only in Virginia that this reading of the Constitution was sold. Very prominent Federalists, including James Wilson and Alexander Hamilton, sold it that way in other states, and I can name you 7 states besides Virginia where prominent Federalists said that the federal government was only going to have the enumerated powers, and yet virtually the minute Congress came into being, they were doing things that they hadn't been given, they hadn't been delegated power to do. So Madison ended up being at the center in the 1790s of a constellation of people in Congress who were opposing this. It's not that they thought, okay, we're going to create a party. They just began to vote together because they all had the same perception of what the Federalists, Marshall's party, Alexander Hamilton's party were doing.
Now, in the 1790s, we get a fairly interesting development because, on the one hand, as you said with Madison, he goes to the Philadelphia Convention with the idea of creating a kind of national government, and he's got proposals that are shot down, and we wind up with a federal government afterward. But then, in 1798, he pens the Virginia Resolutions of 1798, which he spends his old age trying to explain away. How does that happen, that he becomes a... Is there a consistency here? Is there an inconsistency here that in 1798 he's taking a radically decentralist position instead of the nationalist one he had held 10 years earlier?
Well, it's been the classic approach to say that Madison did a volte-face at the end of the 1790s, and this was entirely based on the fact that his partisan opponents were in power and he wasn't. I tend to see it a different way. I think that Madison acted in good faith. That is, he went to Philadelphia, he argued for a national government, he was defeated. He went back to Virginia, he explained the Constitution as it was, not as he would have liked it to be. And then once he was in federal office, he was aghast at the fact that some of his coadjutors in bringing the Constitution into being were behaving as if, despite the fact that they had made these promises about enumerated powers, they had been given unlimited power to do whatever they wanted to do. And so he opposed that because he thought it was illegitimate. In some sense, what Madison's career was about was the idea that through written constitutions, people could consent, they could have the kind of government they wanted and only that kind. And even if the people didn't agree to Madison's own proposals, he wasn't going to pretend they had, or he wasn't going to ignore what they had decided, as John Marshall or Alexander Hamilton would do. Then at the end of the 1790s, when he staked out this state rights position, it's not that we should see it as being contrary to what he had proposed in Philadelphia. It surely was different from what he proposed in Philadelphia, but I think what we should do is we should see it as consistent with the way the Constitution was sold in the Virginia Ratification Convention. So there's nothing really different between the Federalist explanation of the Constitution in the Ratification Convention and Madison's statements in 1798 about the limits on federal authority at all.
Kevin, would you have, I know you're a professor and you have a crazy schedule, would you have time to stick around for another segment?
Yes.
Okay. All right, good. So then I'll hold my cannons back to the very end with the huge questions. But we have a few minutes before we have to take a break at the bottom of the hour. But can you describe, I don't want to take for granted that everybody listening knows what the Virginia Resolutions of 1798 was. I mean, I think the education establishment has done a pretty good job making sure nobody knows what that document is. So can you just flesh that out a little bit so that people know what we're talking about?
Well, I tend to assume that there are a lot of people out there who have read Tom Wood's book, Nullification. But in case
I like to presume that, too.
What happened was that in 1798, the Congress adopted a law called the Sedition Act and basically made it illegal to have a free election in the United States because it was criminalizing any criticism of incumbents. And so Jefferson and Madison, along with their fellow leaders in the Virginia Republican Party, decided that if they couldn't rely on the federal executive, legislative, or judicial branch to abide by or enforce the Constitution, what they'd have to do is fall back on the states, which, again, as I said before, was what people in the Federalist Party had told, people in the Federalist movement, people who were advocating ratification, had told the Virginia Ratification Convention they would be able to do. You're going to be one of 13 parties to a compact, and in case the federal government doesn't live up to the description of the Constitution we're giving you here, you'll be able to reclaim the powers you've given it. It was going then ultimately to be the state as a party to the compact that would be responsible for ensuring that the creature of the compact, the federal government, didn't abuse people in that state. So ultimately, what the Virginia and Kentucky legislatures threatened to do was, as Virginia's version, written by Madison, said, to interpose, and as Jefferson's draft for Kentucky said, a nullification was a rightful remedy. They didn't actually come out and say what these words meant, but it was clear to people at the time that they were talking about some kind of resistance because Virginia finally, in that same year, concluded a long-standing dispute over whether to build a new armory in Richmond, and they did do that. They began drilling and outfitting their militia units. Some of the people just below Jefferson and Madison in Republican leadership publicly spoke of secession in 1798, and again, I think this was perfectly consistent with the model of the federal union that the Federalists laid out in the Virginia Ratification Convention.
All right, Kevin, you are just like a model guest because you finished that question just in time for me to start my outro for the break. So just perfect. All right, I want to first of all, I want to tell people we got a couple calls on the line for non-Gutzman related issues that you guys have been very patient. Hang on, when we finish with the guest, I'll take your calls. But if you want to join this conversation and talk to somebody who knows more about this than you could possibly believe about the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, all this stuff, please join us at 855-4-SHIFT. That's 855-472-4433. On the other side of this break, we got a lot more to talk about with Kevin Gutzman about James Madison and the making of America. So you guys stick around on the Peter Schiff Show, the gold standard in talk radio.
The Peter Schiff Show.
We now return to the Peter Schiff Show.
Call in now, 855-4-SHIFT.
That's 855-472-4433.
Rebel Radio. The Peter Schiff Show.
All right, we're back, everybody, on the Peter Schiff Show. Tom Woods in for Peter. I've kept Kevin Gutzman over for a portion of an additional segment, and I appreciate his good-naturedness in agreeing to do this. We're talking about his book released just today, James Madison and the Making of America, published by St. Martin's. Visit Kevin online at Kevin Gutzman, Gutzman, kevingutzman.com. Now, Kevin, overall, now let's given that I feel like we don't have to rush quite so much now. We got this little extra segment. Given the expanse of Madison's career, I mean, he does stuff that's important even before the Ratifying Convention. But we've got him at Philadelphia, the Ratifying Convention. He's got plays an important role in the 1790s, and he's president for 2 terms, and then he's, as you say, he comments negatively on some important Supreme Court decisions. He is an incredibly significant figure. But I find that when you look at Madison's studies, sometimes there are a lot of studies of him that don't look at him warts and all. That just like I remember the Lance Banning book, with the Sacred Fire of Liberty, something like that. And it was just every single thing he did was perfectly consistent, and there was not a blemish to be found. And what I liked about your book is that you're willing to give the man his due, but yet not treat him like a demigod. So, what overall what's the significance of Madison? What is his ultimate legacy? When you look at all the different things he did, what does it all add up to?
Boy, I don't know about adding it up, because he was certainly central to creating the American federal system, but it seems to me, and here I am virtually on an island by myself, it seems to me that his most important contribution to American government and political science in general was in regard to the principle of separation of church and state. This is something that Madison was concerned with from even before he became involved in politics. He was unwell, and so unlike virtually anybody else in the Virginia political elite, he skipped William and Mary and went off to Princeton College. He thought that Williamsburg was unhealthy, and so he went to New Jersey. And what made New Jersey radically different from Virginia was that New Jersey was one of 3 colonies that never had a state church. And, unless you count Delaware as separate from Pennsylvania, then there'd be 4. But in any event, Madison observed the effect of this, and then he went home from Princeton in his early 20s and saw that Baptists in his region of Virginia, the Piedmont, were being persecuted with whippings and jailings and being put in stocks and having people, lock the doors in their churches and throw beehives through the window and all kinds of absurd mistreatment. And Madison decided this was the central question when it came to liberty. And he actually wrote to a Pennsylvanian friend of his and said, I think that if we had all agreed on the established church we ought to have, and even if it had been the right one, it still would be undesirable to establish it, because where you have an establishment of religion, you just have unfreedom generally. People get used to the idea of being imposed upon. And so from the very first time he held elective office in a parliamentary body in 1776, Madison was thinking about how to give people religious freedom. And he was 25 years old when he coined the phrase free exercise of religion as an alternative to the traditional British liberal position, toleration. Toleration, of course, implied that the government knew better than you, stupid citizen, but we're going to put up with you for now. And Madison objected to that. When he made his argument against it, George Mason, the chief constitutional thinker in that body, agreed with him, and then the convention adopted that position unanimously. So it became part of the first American Declaration of Rights, the Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776. Of course, we know that Madison later played the lead role in writing the First Amendment to the federal Constitution and used the same language. But that wasn't it. I mean, he worked throughout his life on this idea. He had the famous Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom adopted by the Virginia legislature. Here we see Madison's personality in full flower, because if you ask any historian who was responsible for the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, he will say, just as a matter of course, well, Thomas Jefferson. And the reason he'll say Thomas Jefferson is that Thomas Jefferson had the foresight to draw a little sketch of his own gravestone, and among other things, he wanted it to say that he was the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. But we don't usually credit the draftsman of a bill with it. We don't usually say the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the responsibility of some obscure lawyer in the Senate Judiciary Committee, right? We credit Lyndon Johnson for that. So that Jefferson was analogous to that obscure lawyer. It was Madison who took the Johnson role and got the bill passed and made Virginia the first officially secular government in the world. When he was president, Madison twice had occasion to veto laws that he thought transgressed upon the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And I think today, yesterday I did a book signing at my university, and people asked me, actually one very young woman asked me, well, how is Madison's story relevant today? And I said, well, turn on the news and watch the way women are treated in Muslim countries. Right? Watch the sectarian violence that's going on all over the world. We don't have this problem in America in general, and the main figure who's responsible for the fact that we don't have this issue as a live issue in the United States is James Madison. So it seems to me that although he held all the ritzy offices and, he has the, I think, exaggerated reputation as the father of the Constitution, far the most important thing that he did was that. In fact, I think there'd be something like our current system of government in America, even if James Madison had never lived, in terms of the structure of the central government. But as to this principle of separation of church and state, I think Madison was largely responsible for that.
Now, I guess the last sort of thing I want to raise is we look at Madison's career, we look at the Constitution, we look at the situation that we're in right now, where as you and I have documented, they don't care about the Constitution. Madison seemed reasonably confident that people would elect people of virtue to office, and this way the Constitution would not be abused, its clauses would not be interpreted in broad and absurd ways that were obviously counter to the original intent. But yet, given that this project that he worked on, that he wanted to give more power to, and he treated opponents of the Constitution quite contemptuously, given that already in his lifetime there were major problems with it, with some of the clauses being exploited and used badly. Does this not reflect badly on him, that he either did not anticipate this or didn't favor building in enough safeguards to stop it? Or are there safeguards that can stop it?
Well, I do think that it's true that during the ratification process, Madison was contemptuous of people who didn't want to ratify the Constitution, yes. However, I think that he realized shortly thereafter that not only had Virginians adopted the Constitution on the ground that it was going to grant limited power to the central government, but this was a good idea. So he became persuaded that that was a good idea. He had been wrong, I think, and I think he thought he had been wrong about that. Now, when he was an old man, he denied that he had ever taken that nationalist position, and there he was perhaps behaving as an old person will and remembering things in a more kindly light than he ought to have done. But as to his foresight, well, I don't think you could say that he was sanguine about things. He was one who said things such as, well, if Republican government is going to succeed, then the people have to be understood as generally electing wise rulers. He didn't say Republican government will succeed because people will elect wise rulers. He really had the attitude that is famously captured by Winston Churchill, saying, well, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. That's a very Madisonian kind of a sentiment. He didn't have any illusions about human nature, and here he's different from Jefferson, who was kind of beholden to Enlightenment French ideas about the perfectibility of man. Madison was strongly influenced by the Protestantism of his own home and of Princeton, which was run by a Presbyterian divine when he went there, and always thought that people were just, inherently corrupt and selfish and sinners, essentially, although he wouldn't have used that word.
Well, folks, I have read Kevin's book, and in fact, I'll be reviewing it for an online outlet pretty soon, James Madison and the Making of America. And I'll tell you something. You're not just going to learn about James Madison, but of course you will. You're going to learn an awful lot about American history, because obviously if you study somebody as significant as Madison, that's unavoidable. And if you're interested in a lot of these issues of government, the Constitution, liberty, states, federal government, then I think Kevin has got a knowledge of the primary sources and the secondary literature that is just second to none. And so I think, frankly, you'd be crazy not to read this book. A very, very important addition to your library. One last thing, Kevin. I know you're working on, you have a follow-up to this coming up on the conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton and how it helped make America. But in just 1 minute, why did you say to yourself, the world needs another Madison biography? You've got at least a dozen major changes, I think, to the received wisdom on Madison, and I'm being unfair in asking you to summarize that in a minute. But why did you decide to do it?
Well, as you said, I found several different places at which I just radically disagreed with what we've been told about Madison, notably the one we were talking about earlier in regard to the way that the Federalists sold the Constitution in the Richmond Ratification Convention. I mean, that's just emblematic of several other places where I thought over time, as I was writing about various other questions and kept kind of having them intersect with Madison, you know what, that's not quite right. What people are saying about Madison and nullification isn't quite right. What people say about Madison and the Constitution isn't quite right. The Madison taking the back seat to Jefferson in regard to this disestablishment in Virginia, that's not quite right. And so Madison's inflated reputation as an author of the Federalist, whose significance is really inflated today. In its own time, it was not very important at all. That's not quite right either. So once there had come to be enough data points like that, I realized I needed to write a book about him.
And we're very much in your debt that you did so, and I'm glad that it's won so much praise from so many people of significance. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been joined by Kevin Gutzman, author of James Madison and the Making of America. Visit him at kevingutzman.com. And we've got several calls on the line, so I will take them as fast as possible after the break. We're going to just do them in rapid-fire succession, so give me your question really fast. I want to thank Kevin Gutzman for being with us. Check out his book on James Madison. We'll see you on the other side of this break on The Peter Schiff Show.
Let's get it right. Oh, stand up. Let's keep it tight.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Come on, stand up. Let's get it together.
Since the Peter Schiff Show was last on the air, the national debt added another $7.89 million. Luckily, Peter's intelligence is growing twice as fast.
That's incredible.
Welcome back to your source of sanity in an insane world. It's the Peter Schiff Show.
All right, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. I'm Tom Woods in for Peter, and this is your dose of sanity in an insane world, but this is going to be an insane segment because we've got several calls to try to stuff in there before we get out of here. Before I do that, I just want to point out I've got several events going on around the country that I hope you will consider attending if you live nearby. Greenville, South Carolina, Philadelphia, Des Moines, and Indianapolis so far. And you'll find details about those and other events at my website, tomwoods.com, where I try to blog fairly regularly and keep a lot of useful information up there for you guys. But let's zip over here. We've had some extremely patient callers. I mean, really, this belongs in the Guinness Book of World Records. I want to go to Glenn in Arlington, Virginia. Glenn, if you can make your question as quick as possible, I'd sure appreciate it. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I've spoken to some in the I like Ron Paul except for his foreign policy crowd who actually agree with him on requiring declarations of war, but they're worried that he's a pacifist that wouldn't defend America. So my question is it correct that the president has a duty to wage war when Congress declares it, whether or not he personally thinks the country should get involved? And if so, can Ron Paul move the debate onto his turf by emphasizing that point? showing that it's Congress's choice, so when the president would go to war is irrelevant.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Glenn, for that call. Well, I'm thinking in particular of Grover Cleveland in the 1890s when he was very much against taking military action regarding Cuba, and he was told, and he basically said that if any declaration of war is passed by Congress, then I'm just simply going to refuse to send out the troops. So, there is that example. It didn't actually happen, but he did say that. But I think Dr. Paul has already said, and he's just said it himself, and I don't think, whatever else you can say about Ron Paul, he's not a liar. And he has said that if Congress examines the information and seriously believes that there's a threat to our national security, then they declare the war, and we go to war and we win it quickly. Now, I'm not giving you my view. That's what I have heard as his stated view repeatedly. So I think you just quote him as saying that, and that should pretty much do it. Okay, let's zip on over to Wolfgang in Las Vegas. Welcome to the program.
Hi, I'm a Nevada delegate, and we are irate out here in the grassroots. We're ready to tear up our delegate forms. He doesn't campaign. He won't take questions from undecided voters at town halls. He doesn't go to the churches like Santorum, like a real candidate. He won't look people in the eye and answer their questions. He won't put his ideas to the test. He could set up and just take questions for 4 hours. We would have it streamed onto the internet, and we would make our own news. They couldn't avoid covering this. We've got the best opportunity we've ever had, and he's sitting in Texas. Hello?
Well, yeah. Well, I'm just thinking this over. All right. Well, thanks for.
I've been waiting 30 years as a libertarian for this. He could be holding court, answering all the questions, getting into the details. I know he has the answers. Every time they let him do it, he's great. But he won't do it, and he's had this chance now. Why not?
All right. Well, thanks for the call. Unfortunately, you're asking the wrong person. I have no connection to the campaign. I don't know what their strategy is or why they're choosing to do things or to omit doing them. So I wish I could help, and I agree. I think there are ways that he could, that his time could be spent more effectively in terms of voter outreach and getting to people who might be skeptical of him and allaying their concerns. I think there's an awful lot that can be done in that regard. And I've gone on the radio I was on the Steve Deace show. It's a major evangelical show. And I went on to make the case to evangelicals. The campaign would not feature the candidate on that show. So I went on. I'm not even with the campaign. And I think of course there's a case to be made. There's a case to be made for anybody who's a human being, much less evangelical or anything else, for Ron Paul. So, I agree. I'm frustrated a lot too. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge this is a guy in his late 70s who is up at the crack of dawn every day, who's briefed on current events, knows everything that's going on, flying around the country like crazy, attending multiple events in a day. They were flying him around. He was in Iowa campaigning the day of a debate in New Hampshire, and then they just raced him over there. At some level, we do have to cut the guy some slack in light of all this. Okay, and finally, let's go to Roger in North Carolina. We just may succeed in getting to all these questions. Roger, welcome to the program.
Hi, Tom. I had an initial question on Elliot's notes for the debates for Kevin, but he seems to be gone, I guess.
Yeah, sorry.
I suspected those were the background for a lot of his book and had a question on that. But for you, next year's the centennial of not only the Fed, but the 16th Amendment on the income tax and the 17th Amendment for popular election of senators. And in my mind, all three should be repealed. And what are your thoughts on the 17th Amendment and its impact on federalism?
Okay, thanks for the call, Roger. I talked a little bit about this in Nullification, my book from 2010. The 17th Amendment, for people who don't know, involves, as you say, the direct election of senators instead of having them elected by state legislatures. And the initial idea of having them elected by state legislatures was that this would tie them more closely to the states, that they would be, to some degree, almost like ambassadors of the states. And if you have both the House and the Senate elected by popular vote, then there's almost no point in having a House and a Senate. The idea is that there are two different aspects that are being represented here. You have the people, but then you also have the states as distinct political societies also having a voice. And even though some states are bigger than others, they all have equal dignity as states, and so at some point they need to have equal representation, and it was thought that this was the way to do it. I think my suspicion is that I think the emphasis on this is maybe greater than it ought to be. I think there are a lot more contributing factors to the position that we're in now than the 17th Amendment, but anything that gets people thinking in outside-the-box ways is helpful from my point of view. And, of course, the 16th Amendment, now you can even see some legal arguments, by the way, that argue that the 16th Amendment was unnecessary and they could come up with some constitutional rationale for an income tax. So I would favor replacing the 16th Amendment with an amendment prohibiting an income tax so that there's no way that they can claim that they dug around and found one. And as for the Fed, well, I just find it incredible that finally we're living in a time when people are considering the possibility of living without this institution, that it would not be the end of the world. The Fed has not given us fewer and shallower recessions and all the rest of the propaganda. I talk a lot about that in my book, Rollback, which is the book I wrote to help people win debates when they're in debates about this or safety regulation or stimulus or whatever. You can just smack down your opponents with Rollback. All right, that's it, folks. I want to thank my guests, Kevin Gutzman and Lou Rockwell. Check me out at tomwoods.com so that you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Peter should be back tomorrow, but I didn't bother to check on that before I went on, so who knows? Don't hold it against me if he's not. But always a pleasure being with you guys. Thanks for making it a great 2 hours. Catch you next time.
The Peter Schiff Show.
It's a home I stepped